modern types of political systems that are out there, and also briefly go over different ways power gets distributed. So we are going to start out today with modern monarchies. Um, Keep an eye on the real world examples. As long as you know one of each, you're probably pretty good for any quiz or thingamajig that might come up later to assess whether or not you listened and paid attention to this. But also make sure you don't leave this stuff out. So be able to briefly summarize what each one of these does and then give me like an example. So let's get going. Modern monarchies. Um, what we would refer to as a traditional monarchy is probably what you're thinking of the second you saw the word king and queen right there. They're going to make unilateral decisions, which means they are the only one with decision-making power. They might have advisors, they might have, some sort of representative body, but at the end of the day, in a traditional monarchy, the king or the queen is the only one that calls the shots. There are fewer of these now than there used to be. They've been sort of dripping away since the mid 1600s, when England pointed out that, oh, hey, if you have a terrible king, you could just kill them and then choose who you want to be in charge. But we'll get to that in a second. So unilateral or nearly unilateral decisions with very little pushback. If you mouth off to a traditional king or queen, it's, your Alice in Wonderland off with his head or off with their head sort of situation. It's resulted in some sticky situations recently. All three of these examples. So Thailand, this is their former king. I will not attempt to pronounce his name. Regarded as a pretty good king. He's playing a saxophone there. He was regarded as a pretty dang good jazz saxophonist, actually. He played with a number of famous jazz people. Again, names I won't attempt to remember because I don't do jazz. But so here's the thing, like, hey, it's awesome. We've got a king that plays jazz saxophone and, is friends with Miles Davis or whatever. That's awesome. And on one hand, that's fine, but this is where you get to the unilateral decisions part. There was a national law in Thailand that was in effect up to when this guy died, like 3 years ago, that if you talked mess about the king's jazz saxophonery, they could arrest you for it. If you besmirched his jazz saxophone skill, you could go to jail. Does that seem stupid and petty? It should, because it is. But too bad. It's a traditional monarchy. He can do what he wants. On the right here is the current king of Thailand, who took over. He's in his mid 50s to early 60s in that picture. He's crazy. Absolute party boy. That's him getting off a jet, wearing his crop top and what appears to be socks with sandals, and getting into, a very expensive Mercedes there. You talk mess about him, he'll arrest you. He was the first king in Thai history last year or the year before to have a royal mistress that just hung out with him, and then she said one bad thing about him, and she was immediately arrested, never to be heard from again. So they can be a unifying force within the country. They can help modernize a country. That's what the king of Saudi Arabia did. He was regarded as a pretty good king. Relatively speaking, Saudi Arabia is still super oppressive. But his son, Mohammed bin Salman, who you've probably heard of, clearly wants his dad, or I'm sorry, his grandfather at this point, to kick the bucket and die. This is the guy who's going to be taking over. He's a unifying force within the country for good and for ill. When it became clear that he was going to take over, he's their like Secretary of Defense, basically. He had arrested anybody in the country that disagreed with him, any family members in a very large family, and basically shook them down for hundreds of millions of dollars. He had a journalist that he used to be friends with, Jamal Khashoggi. You might have heard about this a couple years ago, who wrote some unflattering stories about him. And he had Jamal Khashoggi murdered in a Saudi Arabian consulate in Turkey, and then had the body dismembered and disappeared, quote unquote. So yes, he's making the country a better, more modern place for business, but he's also, very likely to be a tyrant and destabilize the country on the international scene as well. So it goes both ways. Down here is the king of Swaziland, looking very fly in his Swazilandish clothes. So there's your modern monarchy, kind of like a dictatorship, but instead of being taken over by force, it is taken over by, a hereditary king or queen. All right, done with saxophones and petrodollar murders. Moving on. Constitutional monarchies are probably what you think of nowadays when you think of kings or queens. Here is the King of Sweden in one of my all-time favorite pictures, getting real hyped at the Olympics, much to the chagrin of the woman sitting in front of him. You got the Queen of England, obviously. You've got, I believe this is the Prince of Denmark and his wife. He's just in there because who wears a velour suit? The Emperor and Empress of Japan. And then we'll get to Sir Nils Olav in a second because I do love that penguin. All right, so constitutional monarchies are what I referred to on the last one. This takes place after the Glorious Revolution in England. Basically, the English people decided in the late 1600s that the kings and queens they had were doing a bad job and they wanted a new one. So they kicked the old king out and they brought in a new king and queen. And that has been the royal family that's been there ever since. What they do is they act as more of a figurehead of state. They're there to, wear fun hats at coronations or to, hype up their athletes at international sporting events. They don't do a lot of kingly and queenly stuff. They're there to appear on money, essentially. They're there because they matter to the culture of that country. These countries have had, emperors and empresses since time immemorial, kings and queens where you can, track them back to 800 AD, came from the Vikings, all that sort of stuff. If they do make decisions, it depends on approval from a representative body. Usually, 99.9% of the time, a modern monarchy is going to have what we'll see in a little bit, but essentially they're going to have a parliament, which means they will have a body of elected individuals that will make a decision, and then the monarch is there to rubber stamp those decisions. So, for example, Queen Elizabeth has no real job other than she has to quote unquote approve the new prime minister of the parliament, and she gives a speech at the beginning of each opening of parliament. Not every day, but of a new season or session of parliament. And that's basically it. Otherwise, she wears funny hats and runs around with her corgis and tries to avoid her very racist husband. The powers that they do have, kind of like I mentioned there, are largely ceremonial. This is how we get Sir Nils Olav of Norway. Sir Nils here is a penguin. He has been knighted by the King of Denmark. Maybe it's the King of Norway. It's one of the two. Norway, it says there right there, Norway. He's been knighted by the King of Norway, and he serves a ceremonial role. He is a military officer in the Norwegian army. He doesn't even live in Norway. He lives at a zoo in Scotland, but that is Sir Nils Olav. So that's what I'm talking about with ceremonial powers. And like the Norwegians have a good sense of humor about this, as do the Scots. Whereas if you were to make fun of, this dude knighting a penguin, they might throw you in jail. Whereas the King of Norway is like, yo, that's awesome. I knighted a penguin. So modern monarchies are a little more laid back, very, very ceremonial. So United Kingdom, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Japan, Norway, those are your modern constitutional monarchies. So that's sort of the key to remember is there's two types of modern monarchies. You have traditional and you have constitutional. Traditional is, your King John from Robin Hood. Your modern is Queen Elizabeth II. All right, moving on. Dictatorships. This will be another point where I ask you to pause for a second and to open up the other video. It's fantastic, and it is eerily accurate to Venezuela. So, a dictatorship, the dictator holds powers and rules by strength of force. The dictator is usually former military or was put in place by the military and has stuck around. You're not going to have elections in a dictatorship. You might pretend to have elections, but the outcome is a foregone conclusion, and you're going to stick around. There is a hereditary dictatorship, and that is North Korea. So, for example, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, was put in charge by the Russians and to a lesser extent the Chinese. And his family has just stayed there ever since. Sometimes the military will take over and depose the government. That does not happen as much anymore. It's usually you've been put in power by another state. The military is usually going to run the state, largely because they are going to be paid very, very handsomely by the dictator, be that Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. Their families will live in fear of a dictator like Kim Jong-un, who might throw you, your children, and your grandparents, as well as your parents, into a concentration camp until all of you die, so that any form of disrespect for the government is erased. So it's horrific there. Maduro won't feed people that he doesn't like. Turkmenistan is my personal favorite dictatorship, which is a weird thing to say, but Turkmenistan is super weird. So Turkmenistan is sandwiched between Iran and Uzbekistan in Central Asia. The former head of Turkmenistan, a guy who went by the name of Turkmenbashi, Saparmurat Niyazov, those are all real names. Turkmenbashi meant like leader of the Turkmen people. His name was Saparmurat Niyazov. Created his own religion after the Soviet Union fell, wrote his own version of a religious text, so a Bible or a Torah, whatever analogy you want to make there, about how he had created the world and the religion was all based around him. There were songs about him. He had this giant arch built that had this statue on it the statue would rotate so it always faced the sun and glinted. And then he kicked the bucket, and his former dentist took over the country. And his former dentist is still there, still running the dictatorship because he's paying off the military. And it's a weird, repressive country. He puts out videos every once in a while. There was one of my friends sent me last year of him singing about horses on state television. So dictatorships are very weird, very idiosyncratic, because they kind of draft off of whatever the leader thinks is cool, which is why you will see stories about the North Koreans worshiping Kim Il-sung, the first leader of North Korea, treating him as a god and venerating the mountain where supposedly he was born fully formed riding on a unicorn. Again, this sounds like I just made it up. This is all fact. You can look it all up. The problem with dictatorships is they're hard to maintain, because the second you lose your grip on the military or the people stop fearing you, they're going to run you out of town on a rail. They're probably going to kill you. So very, very, very repressive societies as a result, because if you give people too much freedom, they're going to realize that they want more freedom, and they don't want, some pudgy little monster or a former bus driver or a dentist running the country. They'd prefer somebody who actually could, feed them and let them buy jeans or get McDonald's or an Xbox or whatever. None of these countries allow for that sort of thing. So there's your dictatorships, holding on to rule by strength of force. Then we've got theocracy. This is a short one. There are 1.5 theocracies in the world. They are led by a religious leader. Their laws, their decisions are based on interpretation of holy texts. Saudi Arabia is almost a theocracy, as their law is based on the Quran and only the Quran, but it doesn't really fit because, as we established earlier, they're a traditional monarchy. They have a king, and he calls the shots. It is not run by a religious leader. So instead, your options for theocracy are either Iran or Vatican City. And Vatican City is only kind of half a theocracy, because the enforcement of laws in Vatican City is actually up to the police of Rome and the Italian federal police. I mean, it's literally like the size of like the school campus. It's very small. So the only real theocracy in the world, and what you always want to associate with theocracy, is Iran. It is run by the Ayatollah Khamenei. He was preceded by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and they run the country based on religious law. There is an elected body there, but everybody who's going to join that elected body needs to be cleared by a non-elected tribunal of religious leaders. So completely run off of religion. It does not work. They're incredibly repressive, and every generation, historically speaking, tends to get a little more liberal, a little more, hey, we're okay with things that the people in the past weren't okay with, and wants change. That's happened a couple times. There have been 2 near revolutions in Iran in your guys' lifetime, and their economy is more and more in the toilet every year, and the younger people clearly want some sort of change. So we'll see how that goes. But theocracy not working out real well for Iran. Vatican City's doing okay because it's like, 6 acres. It's a little easier to run when you have 30 people living there as opposed to, an actual country. All right, so that's theocracy. It's quick, religious-based decisions, religious leaders. Single party rule. Okay. Theoretically, if we wanted, we could have thrown Venezuela in here too, but Venezuela technically has elections. These countries don't. So single party rule, you only have one legal or acknowledged political party. Nobody else gets to run. So you're still going to have a quote unquote election, but you can only vote for the Communist Party, Assad's party. So it's basically just another form of dictatorship. Small group of elites are going to make the laws. So in this case, it's going to be, the Castro family. In this case, it'll be the al-Assad family. In this case, it's the Chinese Communist Party. They are going to make all of the laws. Decisions are made beforehand. Any sort of debate over them is solely for show. There's not going to be any sort of substantive debate. And the laws are there largely to keep whatever single party is in power. Syria, Vietnam, China, Cuba. Hopefully you looked at those 4 countries and said, hey, wait a minute, 3 of those countries are communist. That is accurate. But again, it's not true communism there. It's much more of a single party dictatorship masquerading as communism to make the people understand why they're getting subpar goods and treatment and no real economic freedom. So there's your single party rule. Next up, we have direct democracy. There are no pictures on this because there are no direct democracies. Direct democracy in its purest sense means there's equal input from all citizens who wish to participate. So if we were to just say this class, there's about 30 of you plus me, everybody's voice would count the same. So when we're deciding, are we going to have a test on this, everybody would vote, and whatever the most popular vote was would win. It's incredibly unwieldy because every decision in a direct democracy is supposed to be made. Are we going to do this? Are we going to do that? Everything has to be voted on, counted, and then implemented. People's minds change. So it's very, very, very tedious to get anything done there. The only real country that gets close to a direct democracy is Switzerland, who regularly vote in what's called the referenda system, where the elected officials that they elect will write laws, but then the people have to sign off on it. And really, if you think about it, the point of a representative democracy is that we elect people to make those decisions for us, saying, hey, we trust you, Steve Daines or John Tester, to vote for, or, to do this stuff for us in the Senate. It's not like we expect the Senate to send us an email. It's like, hey, are you cool with this? Please check yes or no. And if you don't check yes or no, then, your vote doesn't count. Which is to say, it's really, really hard to do this. The U.S. uses ballot measures and constitutional amendments to do this, but even then, there are usually some checks on that. So direct democracy is not ever used on a national scale. The last time that we got remotely close to it really was ancient Greece, and even then, only men could do it. So it's not really a direct democracy if only half your population's doing it. So direct democracy, not really a thing, but that's how it would work. Okay. Now we're going to get into the 2 that you're most familiar with, I would think. First up is a parliamentary democracy. So the party or parties with the largest legislative representation rules. So a parliamentary democracy has a bunch of parties. The key thing for you to remember with parliamentary democracy here is that it is a multi-party system. The United States presidential democracies are 2-party systems. We'll talk about that next. So multi-party system. So you'll have 10, 15 different parties competing. And then the next step there, and this is key here, is they engage in coalition building. Okay, so what is coalition building? The simplest way to describe it is we'll use Germany as an example. This is Angela Merkel. She runs Germany. She keeps wanting to retire. She's very tired of holding all of Europe together, but nobody wants to take her job. So Germany has about 27-ish independent political parties, about 8 or 9 of which will make it past the threshold to get on a ballot, which means there's enough people that want to vote from that it's worth printing their name on the ballot. And then usually different numbers of all 9 of those groups will get in to what is called the Bundestag. And that is their sort of Congress, their parliament. And then what happens is you need a majority in that parliament to rule. So you engage in coalition building. So Angela Merkel runs a group of center-left parties called the Christian Democratic Party. And what she will do is she'll say, okay, so we've got about 35% of these seats here. We need another 15 plus 1 to run the Bundestag. So what she'll do is she'll go out to parties that lean a little further to the left of her and a little further to the right and say, hey, if you join up with us, if you join in this coalition with us, then I'll help you guys pass laws you want if you help me pass laws that I want. Kind of that log rolling stuff that we talked about earlier. And so, hey, great. She got a bunch of the parties to her left to sign up. So now we're up to, let's say, 47%. Cool. So now she's going to lean over to those parties on her right and say, hey, whatever 4% of you can show up to put me over the 51% line so I can run parliament here, so I can run the Bundestag, I'll help you out. And so then you'll usually have a smaller party that sort of agrees with her pop up and sort of tentatively raise their hand and say, yeah, okay, we'll help you out in exchange for you keeping us in mind when you're writing legislation. So the upside to this is that you get a very wide spectrum of voices representing the country. It's not just group A or group B, it's anywhere from, group A to group ZZ. And because of that, you will have very moderate, usually, political positions taken that's not really going to honk anybody off. So that's good. The voters have really great ideological flexibility. If you don't agree with one group, you can still vote for a similar group and trust that you're still going to have largely the people you want in some facet of power. If you're kind of have more fringe or more extremist beliefs, you're probably not going to get somebody who's going to be running the country, but maybe they will join up with somebody who's running the country. This is Boris Johnson. He's the head of the Conservative Party in Britain. This is Justin Trudeau. He heads the Labour Party in Canada, and this is Narendra Modi. He runs the somewhat conservative BJP party in India. So the major party and then will elect a prime minister or a chancellor. Angela Merkel is a chancellor. The rest of these guys are all prime ministers. It's the same job. It's just a different term. So the key thing to remember here is that once that coalition is built, they need to decide who's going to be in charge of it. So they are going to elect a member of parliament. So they don't vote for a president in these countries. Instead, everybody votes for a member of parliament, and then they choose from there who's going to be doing it. So, it's very clear from the beginning when these elections happen, hey, Justin Trudeau will be our prime minister if the Liberal Party in Canada wins. Boris Johnson will be the prime minister if the Tories, the Conservative Party in Great Britain wins. Angela Merkel, you get the idea. So there's regularly scheduled elections, usually every 4 years, but if enough people drop out of that coalition, so say Angela Merkel's coalition falls apart and she no longer has 51%, what can happen is that parliament can call what is called a vote of no confidence, which basically says the country doesn't think you're doing a good enough job anymore. And so the members of parliament will all vote and say whether or not they believe Angela Merkel should still be running the country. And as long as she holds on to 51% of that vote, she gets to stay in charge. But also, if she loses that, then you are going to have an election within a specific amount of time, usually about 6 weeks. The prime minister can also do this on their own. So if they think that they're just doing super hot right now, Trudeau thinks that he's just killing it in Canada, and what he can do is he can call what's called a snap election. Usually this doesn't happen in Canada. Usually it happens in the UK. But you can basically say, hey, we're doing so well right now. I like the way the country's going. We're going to move up our election. Our election wasn't supposed to be for 2 years. Instead, we're going to do it in 6 months. And the hope with that, if you are a good prime minister and you are politically astute, is that you will pick up more seats. More of your party will join, and you don't need as many people in your coalition, which means that you can make laws that are more in line with your party's beliefs as opposed to the beliefs of everybody in your coalition. Tons and tons of countries do this. Canada, the UK, Australia. Russia does not do a great job with it. They technically have a parliament, but they're very weird. Australia has a really bad track record with prime ministers recently. Their parliament gets stuff done, but their prime ministers have a tendency to have just been awful and constantly put their foot in their mouth. Germany's got one. South Africa's got one. India's got one. What trend do we see here? The vast majority of these countries have been ruled at one point by Great Britain. India, South Africa, Australia, the UK, Canada. So that's where that idea comes from. So our big things to take away from parliamentary democracy: multi-party system based on coalition building. They have a prime minister. Cool. All right. This one I would assume you're familiar with. Boy, you better be at least a little familiar with this. I mean, you're taking this class, but dang, come on. Okay, presidential democracy. The president is either elected by the people or by electors who are told to vote for by the people. This is what you are used to. It's usually a popular vote, but in the US, obviously, we have the Electoral College. Next up, usually a small number of political parties in a presidential democracy. We're looking at 2, maybe 3 parties, Democrats, Republicans, usually, in our case. We don't need to know the names of like what the political parties in Uruguay are. It's immaterial. All right, next up, this is the big thing. The president in a presidential democracy is going to be the head of the executive branch of government, rather than just a ranking member, that's what that says there, member, of the legislative branch. So they are elected to be the leader as opposed to elected to be a representative and then chosen to be a leader by their peers. I hope that makes sense. So remember, presidential, the people are directly choosing the president, whereas parliamentary, they are choosing the party of the prime minister, and then the party is going to choose who the prime minister gets to be. Again, if you have questions, please ask, and we can go over this more. I know sometimes this confuses people. Because they are directly elected, they are really on the hook to the entire country to do what the people want. So if they make a decision that is patently unpopular, they're not going to get reelected. So they need to sort of toe the party line. Usually you'll see the president do their most aggressive sort of political movements during their first 2 years as president, while they still are running off the goodwill of their elections. So let's see, what are big things presidents have done? So Lyndon Johnson, for example, uses his reelection and the death of John F. Kennedy to get a bunch of civil rights legislation and the 24th Amendment passed because he's very, very popular at the time. And so he gets that done. And then as his term winds down, the Vietnam War escalates, he realizes, oh boy, I hate this. I can't do this anymore. And doesn't really make any more decisions. This is sort of what President Trump's running into right now, where he's trying to figure out what he can do towards the end of his term with the election coming up that's going to make people want to reelect him. And this post office thing seems to be sort of backfiring on him because a lot of his voters tended to be elderly or more rural living people who rely on the post office for a lot of stuff, be that, checks for Social Security or medication, contract work checks, whatever, communication with other people. So that is not as popular, whereas he tried to do at the beginning of his term to end the Affordable Care Act that President Obama had put in, and it didn't work. It was not popular enough among even the other senators, and senators like John McCain killed his shot to do that. And as a result, President Trump doesn't really have a piece of signature legislation like a lot of previous presidents have had. Presidents are locked into power. It is hard to impeach a president. I'm going to ask you right now, think in your head, how many presidents have been impeached? Good job. The answer is 3, not 4. Richard Nixon was never impeached. It was Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. Nixon resigned before he was impeached. And none of those presidents have been convicted of the impeachment. Impeachment just means you go to trial and the facts are given. But Andrew Johnson survived by 1 vote. Bill Clinton did not get remotely close to being impeached, and Donald Trump didn't really get close either. Checks and balances are required in a presidential democracy to work effectively. So if a president does something dumb, you are supposed to have the legislative and the judicial branch step in and say, whoa, you can't do that, and stop it from happening. So the Supreme Court in the United States could declare presidential action unconstitutional. The legislative branch could refuse to give money to the president to do something like that, or override the president's decision with a law of their own. So checks and balances are required to work effectively. Let's see. We've got a former president of Uruguay here. I have him up there. He hasn't been the president in a while, but I just like him. He's a former political dissident from when Uruguay used to be a military dictatorship. He was tortured for years, held in jail, all that. Comes out, becomes the president, refuses the presidential limo, drives his old VW Bug to work every day with his three-legged dog, refuses the presidential mansion, has it rented out basically for parties and everything else instead to generate more money. Refuses the presidential salary, lives on his government retirement plan instead, and instead lived at the little farmhouse with his wife like 30 miles outside of Montevideo, and then would just like drive into work every day with his one Secret Service agent that the country made him take. So when we were talking about philosopher kings earlier, he is sort of my example of that in the modern day. This is a guy who's clearly running for president and doing the job as the president as a service to his people and not out of self-aggrandizement. This one down here is the president of Mongolia. I put that in there because I think it's awesome that the president of Mongolia dresses like that. Russia is on there as a kinda because Russia has both a parliament and a prime minister as well as a president. But really, Russia, if we look at it, is actually just a dictatorship run by Vladimir Putin. And then obviously you have Donald Trump here, and you have Rodrigo Duterte down here, who is the current president of the Philippines. And he is really this mix of, boy, there are no checks and balances on him, but he responds to what the people have wanted and also sort of rules for fear. He basically opened up vigilante justice on anybody that was doing anything with drugs in his country. The problem is that people use that as a blank check to basically just go kill anybody they didn't like and then say, oh yeah, we heard he was selling weed. And then the government's like, okay, cool. Also, he just recently arrested a prominent reporter who had been doing a bunch of corruption investigations into him. So shady individual there. All right, so home stretch here. We're almost done. This is the last of it right here. There are three ways to divide power. Power rests at the national level, at the state level, and at the local level. So how do we divvy that up to make sure that the people get their voice heard, but laws are still enacted and people are still protected? So option one is a unitary government. This is a national government. It runs everything and can choose to delegate power to the local levels. So if this were America, everything would be run out of Washington, D.C., and the states would all have to answer directly to it. States wouldn't write their own laws unless the president from Washington, D.C. said, hey, guess what, Montana, you can write your own laws when it comes to, speed limits. But other than that, nope, you all have to answer to me. The idea here is that it allows flexibility to deal with specific regional issues. So what would likely happen in a unitary government in the United States is the president would say like, hey, states west of the Rockies, you've got some water issues. I'm going to delegate the power to you to figure out how you want to get more water. States in the South, I'm going to give you guys the power to, set up your own hurricane relief funds and deal with poverty there, whatever. So the idea is that in a unitary government, it's run from one place. So there's one person that is answerable to the country, but they can choose to outsource, if you will, important decisions to locals that can make a more informed decision. So unitary power, the key thing to remember here is all the power rests at the national level. So unitary goes with the national level. Federal is what we have. Some powers are vested at the national level, others at the state level. We share power. So this works best in large areas where different states have different issues and populaces. Because we are not, even though we're both, states west of the Rockies, like I used in that last example, Montana and Washington aren't the same state. We have different populations, we have different sorts of economies, we have different political sorts of beliefs. As a result of that, it wouldn't make sense for the president to just say, all right, Montana, Washington, you guys are all the same. Instead, Montana runs its government, Washington runs its government, and then we both also answer to a national government. So it gets us that flexibility of the unitary government, but at a more local level, so the people have a better voice. The big issue with federalism is you can have questions over who holds the power and when the other side can step in. So when can the federal government interfere with something that the states are doing, or when can the states say basically, whoa, 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 put on the brakes, federal government, this isn't your job, we're going to handle this instead. So that is federalism, is the power is split between national and state level. Unitary, it's all national. Federal, it is national and state shared powers. I'll give you guys a guess what confederal is. Spot the trend here. In a confederal government, state governments are going to hold all of the power. Think back to last year with the Articles of Confederation. They can choose to delegate power to the national level. The US tried this under the Articles of Confederation. It was an unmitigated disaster because the federal government didn't have the power to collect taxes, despite the fact that they had to collect taxes to pay off US debts and pay for an army. US tried this and failed. I mean, if we want to add to that, it was a disaster for the Confederacy in the Civil War as well. Even when they were getting absolutely whomped by General Sherman, is nobody would send supplies to Georgia to help fight against the Northern Army because they needed the supplies for their states. So confederal is much more of kind of a loose association of friends that at the end of the day are more than willing to pull the ripcord and pull out. The only place the confederal government is really working in a modern sense is the EU, where they all sort of work together to set up economic policies and a vague sense of the laws. So in a confederacy, you can still set your own laws. So for example, in Italy, it might be legal to challenge someone to a duel, but in Denmark, it's not. Fine. So if you're an Italian and you go to Denmark and you challenge someone to a duel, you're breaking the law. But if you're a Dane and you go to Italy and you challenge someone to a duel, it's okay. But at the same time, everybody in the EU has to follow the same policy when it comes to selling smoked fish. I realize that sounds arbitrary, but that was a big argument that was made during Brexit last year. So confederal government, states hold all of the power, and they can choose if they want to delegate it to the national government. So unitary and confederal are exact opposites of each other, and federal, which the United States has chosen the middle ground. So that's it. Hopefully you've got a handle now on the different forms of government, a thing or two on how each one works, and at least one example of each one, and also that you know the difference between unitary, federal, and confederal government. That's it, party people. Have a good one.